He saved her life in a saloon full of cowards. By morning, an entire war party stood at the town's edge, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. One quiet act of mercy lit the match. Now the hills burn with torches, and the town holds its breath. The wind carried the smell of sagebrush and gun oil. Boot heels ground into dry dirt as the cowboy stepped forward, slow and deliberate, toward the open edge of town. Dust clung to his duster like ash, stiff from the night's cold and the trail behind him. His hat sat low, shading pale eyes that squinted beneath the midday sun, fixed on the far ridge where a line of riders had begun to crest, silent, black, unwavering. No dust kicked up, no banners. Just bodies, horses. A presence like judgment made flesh. The town behind him erupted in motion. A door slammed open. A voice shouted, "They're here!" Someone dropped a crate of tools, the clang of metal sharp and immediate. The blacksmith vanished into his shop. The saloon keeper bolted his windows. A woman dragged her child off the main street by the wrist. The preacher stood on the steps of the chapel, whispering something soft and uneven beneath his breath. Prayer or preparation, it was hard to tell. The girl stood just behind the cowboy, barefoot on packed earth. Before we ride any further into the standoff between a lone cowboy, a hunted girl, and the war party waiting beyond the ridge, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these untold frontier stories alive. Every subscription helps us bring more of these forgotten struggles and moral choices into the light. It's a small gesture, but it makes all the difference. Thank you. Her long black hair whipped across her face with each gust, but she didn't flinch. She held herself still, chin slightly raised, as if daring the riders to see her. "They haven't stopped," someone murmured from the general store porch. The cowboy didn't answer. His hand hovered near the butt of his revolver, but not resting on it. Not yet. Every instinct in him screamed for motion, take cover, call for terms, prepare to kill or be killed, but he stood rooted instead. Not because he trusted what was coming, but because he knew the first hand to twitch would decide everything. He could feel her behind him, not just hear her breathing but feel it. She wasn't hiding, she had chosen to be seen, and in doing so, she had made him visible too. The first drumbeat came faint, almost a trick of the ears. Then a second, slower, like a heartbeat echoing off stone. The line of riders thickened, becoming clearer now, war paint, braided manes, shields slung across backs. They rode in formation, not as raiders, but as emissaries of something older than the town, older than fences and badges and treaties half forgotten. "They ain't here for peace," said the sheriff, stepping out from behind the jailhouse, rifle in hand, sweat already glistening at his temples. The cowboy didn't turn. "Maybe not," he said, "but we'll find out." Another pause. Then the girl spoke, her voice quiet, almost weightless. "They came because of me." The preacher's prayer faltered. The sheriff stiffened. Even the wind seemed to hush. The cowboy's jaw flexed once. "I figured." He stepped forward again, just enough to place himself between the girl and the horizon. His coat shifted in the breeze, revealing the dull metal of his revolver and a ragged strip of red cloth tied around his wrist, an old marker, worn by men who once swore to defend peace, but learned too late that peace often comes at the end of a line. The riders were less than a mile away now, still silent, still watching. And behind him, the town held its breath. The saloon breathed smoke and stale sweat. Light slanted in through the grimy windows, catching on dust motes that hung suspended like judgment. A cracked piano bled out a broken tune from the far corner, played by a man too drunk to know he was alone in the music. Laughter spilled from every crooked table, loose and slurred, wrapping itself around the slow drag of boots across warped floorboards. The girl had come in quiet. She crossed the threshold like she didn't expect the door to stay open behind her. Bare feet, a threadbare shawl, skin marked by sun and story. Her eyes scanned the room not with fear, but with practiced caution. She was looking for water, not trouble. Trouble found her anyway. 3 cowhands, boots up and whiskey downed, noticed her the way buzzards notice a still body. One pointed with his hat, grinning wide through broken teeth. "Look what wandered in," he said, his voice loud enough to silence the piano. The second one laughed. "Must have got lost from her tribe." "Or looking for a man," said the third, already rising. She backed up, but only once. No scream, no plea. Just the stillness of someone used to being hunted. No one moved to help her. The bartender wiped a glass that didn't need wiping. A card dealer folded his hand without looking up. One man stared hard into his drink. Another turned his chair slightly, just enough not to see. The cowboys cornered her near the empty fireplace. One reached for her shawl. And that's when he spoke. "That's enough." The voice cut through the air like a cracked whip, low, gravel heavy, and soaked in finality. Heads turned, cards stilled. The bartender froze, hand mid-polish. He stood from the shadows near the back, halfway between the door and the long bar. Dust on his coat. A scar down the jaw like a dried riverbed. Hat brim low. A man no one had seen come in. One of the cowhands chuckled, eyes bloodshot. "Ain't your business, mister." The cowboy didn't blink. "It is now." Tension coiled like wire. The second cowhand stepped forward, hand hovering near his belt. "She one o' yours?" "No," said the cowboy, "but she ain't one o' yours either." The room held its breath. Then snap. A chair leg cracked as the third man lunged, wood splintered. The girl ducked. The cowboy didn't draw. Not yet. He moved like a door slamming shut shoulder first, driving the attacker into a table. Bottles shattered, the piano stopped. A gun clicked. Everyone froze. The second cowhand held a revolver, hand shaking just slightly. The barrel pointed straight at the cowboy's chest. "You got one shot," he muttered. "Walk out now." The cowboy's eyes didn't move from the girl. She was still crouched, one hand pressed to her chest, silent as winter. The cowboy spoke again, slow and clear. "You don't want to find out how fast I am." No one breathed. And for a long second, the saloon hung there between noise and silence, between mercy and blood. The gun stayed raised, the cowboy stayed still. And behind them, the girl stood up. The morning air hadn't warmed yet when she stepped onto the dirt road that led into town. Dew clung to the dry grass along the edges, beating like sweat on the earth's skin. She came alone, the hem of her dress dark with old dust and the soles of her feet blackened from miles. There was no horse, no escort, no sign that anyone knew she was coming or that she had anywhere to go. Just a worn leather medicine bag slung across her shoulder and a long shadow cast by the rising Sunday. The town was quiet at first. A rooster cried out behind the stables, and the church bell hadn't yet rung for morning chores. The girl passed beneath the hitching posts with a stillness that felt deliberate. Eyes began to follow her before she even reached the general store. Curtains shifted. A hammer stopped mid-swing. Someone pulled their child back into the house by the wrist. She didn't speak. She didn't look up. She just walked into the saloon. The floorboards creaked under her step, the kind of sound that shouldn't have meant anything but did. The place was nearly empty, save for the bartender wiping down glasses and a ranch hand asleep against the far wall, snoring into a crust of dried vomit. She stopped just inside the door. The bag on her shoulder swayed with the motion. Worn fabric, fringed, decorated with beads and bone. Old symbols stitched into it, Apache, maybe. Or older. The bartender looked up, froze for half a second, and then set the glass down. "What are you looking for, girl?" he asked, voice low, not unkind. She didn't answer. She stepped forward and placed both hands on the bar. They were small, calloused, dirt under the nails. She slid a dull coin toward him, copper, nearly worn flat. He glanced at it, then at her face. Young, maybe 16, maybe older. Her expression didn't ask for pity, just water. He poured it from the back tap. Cold. Set the glass down gently, like he didn't want to startle whatever spirit might be watching. She drank in slow sips, never lifting her gaze from the countertop. But the damage was done. A customer entering behind her saw her first, paused, then walked out without ordering. An older woman passing the swinging doors caught a glimpse and whispered something to her companion, something that included the word, "bad sign." It spread quick. "She's one of them, but not from here. Look at her feet, no tracks, no escort. She's got death in that bag." By midday, half the town had an opinion and none had facts. The name she gave, when asked, wasn't understood. Not because it was in another language, but because it didn't fit anywhere, no tribe, no town, no ledger. When the deputy pressed, she just tilted her head and said, "Names are for the living." That scared them more than silence. By the time the sun reached its peak, most had stopped trying to look her way. The bartender let her sit in the corner, glass of water beside her, untouched now. She stared out the window, toward the hills beyond town, where the wind moved through the grass like something waiting. No one knew why she'd come, but some already decided she shouldn't have. They stepped into the sun like two ghosts unspooling from the dark. The saloon doors creaked once behind them, then fell still. Dust swirled at their boots, stirred by the breeze and by the aftermath of the fight, inside a silence heavy enough to make glass sweat. The girl walked a pace behind the cowboy, her chin lifted but her shoulders tight. The shawl she wore had torn in the scuffle, exposing a thin welt near her collarbone. She didn't bother to hide it. The cowboy kept his hat low and his hands relaxed. He didn't look at her, not directly, but he didn't walk ahead either. His stride was slower now, measured, like a man waiting for the next sound to be a shot. Windows followed them. Shutters cracked open just wide enough for eyes. Children peeked from behind skirts. One man leaned on a pitchfork like it was a weapon. Another held a bottle, paused mid-drink, watching as if he were trying to decide whether what he saw was bravery or madness. They walked to the edge of the main street, toward the well. He stopped beside it. She did too. Neither spoke. The wind carried the scent of blood and old whiskey from the saloon. Somewhere nearby, a hammer began tapping again, nervously. It stopped just as fast. Finally, she looked at him. Her voice came low. "They're coming now." He nodded, once. "Figured. You could have let them take me." "I don't let things happen," he said, "unless I mean to." She studied him then. Not with fear, not with awe. Just a quiet certainty, like she was trying to learn what kind of man would throw himself into a fight that wasn't his. Behind them, the sheriff stepped off the porch of the jailhouse, boots hitting wood with a heavy rhythm. He had a rifle over one shoulder, a wad of chewing tobacco in his jaw, and a glare that burned hotter than the Sunday. He didn't stop walking until he was close enough for his shadow to touch theirs. "You just bought yourself a war," the sheriff said. The cowboy didn't turn. "Maybe. Don't maybe me, son. You just struck a match in a room soaked in liquor." "She was cornered," the cowboy said. "She was warned," the sheriff snapped. "We all were. You think they send scouts in pretty shawls for sightseeing?" The girl looked at the sheriff, then past him. Her voice was even. "They don't need scouts to see what you are." That hit deeper than any bullet. The sheriff stepped forward. The cowboy shifted his weight, not enough to draw, but enough to make it known. The girl didn't flinch. The sheriff spat into the dirt. "You made your choice, so when they come, and they will, don't expect a badge to back you." The cowboy finally turned his head, just enough to look him in the eye. "Didn't ask for one." They stood there a moment longer. 3 figures carved in heat and dust, and the quiet understanding that something had shifted. Not a decision, but a line drawn sharp in the middle of town, right where old codes and new wounds met. Then the sheriff walked away, and the two of them stood alone in the open. The town began to change before sunset. Not with a scream or a stampede, but with whispers, quiet, poisonous things that slithered between houses and inside ears. They passed through the blacksmith's shop, under the doors of the church, across the pews, into the saloon, curling up the stairs where lamplight barely reached. The girl had no name now, just a label. She's a scout. They'll come for her. She carries blood on her hands, and he took her side. No one said these things to the cowboy's face. But every time he passed, men looked away too quickly, and women gathered their children closer. The deputy walked a wider arc around him, pretending it was habit. And the preacher, who once nodded at every passerby, now kept his door locked after sundown. The girl didn't speak, not even to the cowboy. She sat by the well through most of the evening, still as stone, watching the edge of town where the grass thinned into low hills. Her bag rested in her lap, closed tight, her hands never far from it. Even when the wind picked up, when grit bit into her cheeks and hair tangled across her face, she did not move. A lantern flickered in the sheriff's office. He didn't patrol, he didn't show. But every now and then, the curtains in the upper window twitched. The cowboy worked in silence behind the stable. He sat beneath the slanted roof, whetstone in hand, dragging it slow and steady along the length of a hunting knife. The sound was soft, rhythmic, metal hissing against stone like breath through clenched teeth. Each pull carved a whisper of light across the blade's edge. Sparks didn't fly, there was no show in it. Just preparation. He wasn't expecting to win a war, he wasn't expecting much of anything. But the sharpening brought him peace. It was the kind of motion that had purpose, clear, unforgiving, honest. The town animals felt it first. Chickens began roosting early, huddled in corners they didn't usually choose. Dogs paced and whimpered but didn't bark. One old mutt lay down in the dirt beside the church and refused to move, head low and ears flattened, as if waiting for something he couldn't outrun. By nightfall, the sky had turned the color of an old bruise. The moon struggled behind cloud banks, and the stars seemed unsure whether to show their faces. Then came the drums. They started faint, so distant they might have been imagined. Just a low thump against the earth, slow, irregular. Not music, not yet, but something older. A warning, the rhythm of approach. The bartender heard it and locked both doors, though no one had entered since dusk. The car dealer rolled up his felt mat and muttered about closing early. The preacher stopped reading mid-verse and stared at the spine of his Bible, like it might hold better answers than the pages. The girl still sat by the well. The cowboy didn't ask if she heard the drums. He knew she did. Her fingers pressed tighter against the strap of her bag, her jaw set. He slid the knife one final time across the stone, wiped the blade on his sleeve, and stood. There would be no sleep tonight. The bell rang hard and sudden, shattering the uneasy quiet that had settled over the town like a cold sheet. One strike, then two, then three, too fast to be a call to prayer, too urgent to be anything but alarm. Doors opened, lamps were grabbed, boots hit the dirt with hurried, uneven rhythm. The townsfolk moved not with purpose but with pressure, drawn toward the chapel like cattle herded by an unseen whip. Inside, the air felt thick, humid, with breath and heavy with blame. Wooden pews creaked beneath bodies shifting uncomfortably. The preacher stood near the pulpit, hands clasped, trying to look calm, but his lips were tight, his eyes darting between voices. "She brought them here," someone said. A shopkeeper, his apron still on, fists clenched at his sides. She sat by the well all day, watching like she knew what was coming. "Don't be naive," said a rancher near the window. "It ain't her we should be worried about, it's him. He pulled steel for her, knocked down 3 men for her. That makes him part of it. He made his choice," another voice snapped from the far pew. "But that ain't our choice. Let's not die for strangers." The preacher raised his hand. "Please." But it was drowned out. "She's a scout, maybe even a lure. What's in that bag she carries, huh? Medicine or curses? They won't stop with her. They'll take this town apart piece by piece unless we hand her over. If we act fast, maybe we avoid blood." The church became a hive of panic disguised as reason. Words like sensible, practical, and necessary were tossed like coins at a wishing well no one believed in anymore. All of it came down to the same truth. Fear made cowards sound logical. The girl wasn't there. No one had dared ask her in. And through it all, the cowboy stood at the back of the chapel, leaning against the wall, arms folded. He hadn't moved since the bell rang. No one had looked directly at him, but everyone spoke louder as if to outshout the quiet he carried with him. Finally, someone pointed toward him. "Well, you started this. You going to fix it?" He didn't answer. Another voice, sharp and bitter. "You risked all of us for one girl. What makes her worth a town?" The preacher tried again, softer now. "We are not talking about livestock. We are talking about a human life." But even that was met with groans. Then the cowboy straightened. His boots thudded once as he stepped forward, slow. He didn't walk to the front, just enough to be seen, enough to be heard. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a blade through rope. "They'll remember what we do." That was all. Silence spread, uncomfortable and uneven. The preacher lowered his head. And in that moment, it was clear. The meeting wasn't about votes or strategy. It was about whether fear was heavier than conscience, and whether anyone still knew the difference. The sky dipped into bruised purple as the sun bled out behind the hills. Long shadows stretched across the town like reaching fingers, and the stillness that followed the meeting hung heavy, as if breath itself had been suspended. No one spoke of decisions. No verdict had been declared. But the silence was its own kind of sentence, hung, sealed, and understood. The townsfolk went back to their homes, but windows stayed open. Curtains twitched, rifles sat loaded beside doorframes. Mothers clutched their children without knowing why their hands trembled. Men who had shouted loudest inside the church now whispered their doubts behind locked shutters. The girl remained near the well. She hadn't moved in hours, her figure dark against the gathering twilight. The cowboy stood nearby, leaning on a fence post, chewing a sliver of wood between his teeth. He watched the road, not because he expected something to come, but because he knew it would. And when it did, it wouldn't knock. A breeze stirred the dry grass just beyond town. Then the breeze died, and something shifted on the horizon. A horse. Painted flanks, sun-warmed and scarred by long travel. A figure sat tall upon its back, wrapped in a drape of red and ochre cloth. A war staff, topped with feathers and leather fringe, rose from the saddle like a vertical blade. No banner, no weapon drawn, just the rider, still, present. He had not come to attack. He had come to see. The rider made no sound, not a word, not a whistle. He sat there in the gloaming, his gaze fixed on the layout of the town, the streets, the rooftops, the smoke trails curling from chimneys. He did not look at the people directly. Not the cowboy, not the girl. But he saw them. The wind rose, caught the fringe of his staff, and then fell silent again. The cowboy didn't move. He rested one hand on his belt buckle, the other on the fence rail. His posture was relaxed, but his knuckles were pale. The girl's eyes narrowed. The rider stayed for a full minute longer. Then, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the hills, he turned. Not in a hurry. Not in fear. Just turned, deliberate as a tide, and rode back into the haze. The dust he stirred did not rise. The cowboy exhaled through his nose. "Scout?" The girl nodded slowly. He was counting buildings. He glanced sideways at her. "They know how many you are," she added. Her voice was soft, but the certainty in it made the night feel colder. They'll know where the windows are, which way the doors open, how many guns, how many old men, how many children. The cowboy's jaw worked quietly. Somewhere down the street, a door creaked open, then shut fast. A dog whined under a porch but didn't bark. "We still have time," the girl said, though she didn't sound convinced. He looked toward the hills, toward where the rider had vanished into dusk, and felt the wind shift. Time for what, he didn't know. But it was running out. The first torch appeared just after nightfall, a single flicker of flame atop the far ridge, swaying gently in the wind like a star that had fallen too close to Earth. Then another, then 5 more. Within minutes, the hillside came alive with orange dots, scattered like embers across a blanket of shadow. They didn't move. They didn't approach. They simply were a line of light drawn across the dark, saying everything without saying a word. The cowboy sat on the roof of the boarding house, legs stretched out, one knee bent beneath his elbow. His rifle lay beside him, oiled and quiet. Smoke from the town's chimneys drifted upward, soft and uncertain, like it, too, was holding its breath. From this height, he could see every torch on the ridge and every house in the valley. The contrast was stark, one side, warm and alive, the other cold and braced. Beside him, the girl sat cross-legged on the wooden shingles, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The moonlight made her skin look pale, her eyes deeper than they were in the day. She was cradling her medicine bag in her lap, both hands cupped around its worn shape, thumbs working the edges like she was shaping something invisible. She whispered softly into it. The cowboy didn't ask what she said. He didn't ask what was inside. He didn't ask what she believed, or if she was afraid. Some things weren't meant for speaking, some things just needed room. He watched her for a second longer, then turned his eyes back to the hills. Still no movement, no drums, no cries, just torches, a vigil without morning, a promise without voice. He knew this kind of silence. It wasn't peace, it was calculation. They were waiting. Not for surrender. Not even for dawn. They were waiting for the town to feel it down in its bones, the unease, the weight, the knowing. Below, the townsfolk hadn't lit their own fires. The lamps stayed low, curtains drawn, but shadows moved behind them. Men patrolling in small circles, hands on pistols. Women holding blankets to children's mouths to keep their breathing quiet. No one slept. They weren't waiting for a fight, they were waiting for the moment before the fight. That cruel, uncertain hour where every sound might mean the end. The cowboy adjusted his hat against the wind. It wasn't strong, but it carried a chill, one that slipped beneath coats and collars. The kind of wind that carried memory. He thought about the last time he'd seen torches on a ridge like that. A different town, a different girl. He'd made the wrong choice then. He wouldn't make it again. The girl's whispering stopped. She pulled a small bundle from the bag, a tiny feather, some bone, a fragment of cloth knotted in red thread, and pressed it to her lips before tucking it away. Her eyes met his, but only briefly. There was no question in them, no thanks, just recognition. He gave a small nod. Then they both turned back toward the firelit ridge, waiting for a night that hadn't yet decided what kind of story it would become. The wind had stilled by the time they climbed down from the roof. The town had slipped into a deeper quiet, not the kind that soothed, but the kind that tightened. You could feel it in the way boots scraped slower over dirt, in the way shutters stayed half closed even when no light spilled out. Even the horses in the stable had gone still, noses pressed to the wood like they were listening for something the humans hadn't heard yet. The cowboy led her to the back of the livery barn, where the lanterns couldn't reach and no eyes would follow. An old feed trough sat cracked and empty beneath the eaves. He didn't sit, just leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. She stood in front of him, hands clutching the medicine bag like it might vanish if she loosened her grip. They hadn't spoken since the torches first appeared. The silence between them hadn't been heavy, just full. She looked down at the leather pouch. Her thumb ran along the seam. Then, without a word, she untied the top and reached inside. He watched her fingers move carefully, delicately, like she was handling something alive. When her hand came out, it held only small things, simple things, but they stopped the air between them cold. She laid them out one by one on the trough's edge. A string of black and white beads, worn smooth by years of touch, a pinch of ash wrapped in faded cloth, and a single feather, dark at the base, tipped with dry blood. It curled slightly as it touched the wood, like it remembered the shape of pain. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "It's not a curse," she said. Her voice was low but even. "It's proof." He didn't ask proof of what. But his eyes locked on the beads. At first, they just looked like patterns, geometric, tribal, old. Then his brow furrowed, and he leaned forward just enough to see the alignment more clearly. There were 4 white beads, then 2 black, then a single blue one that had cracked near its base. That arrangement meant something. He'd seen it once before, years back, strung on the wrist of a dying boy near the edges of the territory. The same blue bead, the same crack, a burial token, but not just any. One reserved for kin taken too far from home. He remembered the way the elder woman had pressed it into his hand with trembling fingers and whispered a name he'd forgotten until now. The girl said nothing as he stared. He looked up slowly, the scar on his jaw pale in the moonlight. For a moment, something broke behind his eyes, not fear, not shock. Recognition, memory, and something deeper. Regret. She met his gaze and finally asked, "You knew him?" He didn't answer. Just looked back down at the feather, the blood dried thick at its base. "I took these," she said, "from where they were going to burn him. I carried him out, hid him." Her voice softened, but didn't waver. He was only 8. The cowboy nodded once, slow. That, at least, he understood. Then he reached into his own coat and pulled out a worn piece of leather, dark, frayed, stitched with a single blue thread down the middle. He didn't offer it, he just held it where she could see. It was the same thread, the same pattern, and the same war coming back again. The jailhouse smelled of old sweat, rust, and paper that had sat too long in damp drawers. The iron bars cast long shadows across the floor, stark against the lantern light, each one like a warning carved into the wood. Outside, the air had gone cold. Not from weather, but from the slow encroachment of something inevitable. You could feel it in the way the wind no longer whispered, only watched. The sheriff stood behind his desk, one hand flat against a crumpled wanted poster, the other resting near the grip of his revolver. His badge glinted just enough to remind anyone who entered that law still had a name in this town, though lately, not much of a spine. The cowboy stood on the other side of the room, silent, hat low, dust on his coat from the rooftop, from the road before that. The light caught the edge of the knife still tucked into his belt, the same one he'd sharpened while the town fell into prayerless silence. "You're the reason they're coming," the sheriff said. The cowboy didn't respond. "You think this place is just another scar for you to carry? Another bad night to pack up and walk away from? It's not. We live here. We built here. Still, nothing." The sheriff's jaw tensed. He stepped out from behind the desk, boots scuffing the floor with heavy, deliberate weight. "You walked in with your silence and your ghosts, and now you've gone and tied this town to a war it never asked for." "She was already here," the cowboy said, finally. His voice was low, steady. "I just didn't look away." The sheriff's laugh was short and bitter. "You think that makes you noble?" "No," the cowboy said, "just not a coward." The room went quiet again, but not empty. The words hung between them like smoke. The sheriff took a long breath, and for a moment, his eyes softened. like the weight on his back had finally bent something in him that wouldn't bend back. "I can't stop them," he said. "And neither can you. But maybe they'd listen to you. You started this, you fix it." The cowboy nodded once. No fight, no debate. The sheriff stepped aside as he moved toward the door. "Where are you going?" The cowboy paused with one hand on the frame. "To speak. That'll be a short conversation." "Maybe." He looked over his shoulder. "But it's better than silence." Outside, the sky was black and moonless. The fires on the ridge had gone out one by one, not extinguished but hidden, like teeth behind lips. He saddled his horse with practiced ease. No panic in the motion, no hesitation. Just the deliberate rhythm of a man who knew how to ride alone and how to return if he returned at all. The girl stood nearby, arms folded, watching. She didn't stop him. She didn't ask where he was going. She only said, "They'll listen to you, or they'll kill you." The cowboy swung into the saddle. "Either way," he said, "they'll know I meant it." Then he rode into the night, no torch, no trail. Only the quiet sound of hoofbeats fading into the dark like a question no one wanted to answer. The hills breathed in smoke and silence as he approached. No firelight guided him now. The torches that once lit the ridge had vanished before midnight, swallowed by wind and will. Still, he rode slow, saddle creaking beneath him, until the ground grew too steep for the horse to climb. He dismounted at the base of a rocky incline, tied the reins loose, and continued on foot. Dust clung to his boots. Cold settled into his joints. He didn't draw his coat tighter, didn't wipe the sweat from his brow. He walked as a man does who already knows the shape of his grave. The white cloth around his wrist flapped once in the breeze, just enough to be seen. No weapons hung at his side. His rifle was left behind. His knife, too. All he carried now was the girl's medicine bag, clutched in one hand, pressed against his side like a fragile truth. They saw him long before he saw them. Figures emerged from between the boulders' painted faces, braided hair, chests bare in the chill, adorned with feathers and scars, eyes sharp as flint, movement without sound. They didn't stop him. Not yet. They let him climb, watched how he placed his feet. When he reached the ridge, they surrounded him, not with violence, but with stillness. That was worse. Then the circle parted. The war chief stepped forward. He was older than the others, but not by much. His face was carved by sun and age, his jaw square, eyes burning with something that had never cooled. A long staff rested in his grip, etched with markings that pulsed like veins beneath the moonlight. He didn't speak at first, just looked the cowboy over with a gaze that stripped away name, posture, and intent. He wasn't seeing the man, he was measuring history. The cowboy raised the pouch and lowered himself to one knee, pressing it into the dirt between them. His voice came slow, each word chosen like a step through shallow ice. "I come with no weapon, no lie, no mask." He said it in their language, rough on his tongue, but correct. Honest in its brokenness. The chief said nothing. "She is not scout," the cowboy continued. "She is not thief. She ran to save. Not to spy." The wind answered before the chief did. A long exhale across the rocks. Then came the voice, low, guttural, cold. "She broke the border." The cowboy held his ground. "She broke a law to stop a death. You'd have done the same." The chief stepped closer. His eyes narrowed. "You speak as if you know me. I know what grief makes men do. I know what pride asks us to carry." The chief's lip curled, not in amusement but in pain. "She stole from us. She ran with a life that was promised to fire. You think the old ways bend for mercy?" The cowboy didn't blink. "I think they bend for proof." He opened the pouch, slowly, and pulled out the blood-tipped feather. He held it up, not as threat, not as trophy, just as truth. "I know this mark," he said. I saw it once, a boy's wrist. He didn't make it home. The chief's face flinched, just barely. I remember his name, the cowboy added. Do you? That question hung heavier than any weapon. The night didn't move, not yet. The wind had shifted by the time they led him to the hollow. A shallow dip in the earth ringed with stones, nestled beneath a jutting cliff, hidden from sight unless you knew the path. There was no fire here, no warmth, only the feeling that this place remembered pain. The war chief walked ahead, flanked by two younger men, their faces painted in silence. The cowboy followed, still carrying the pouch, still unarmed, his boots dragging just slightly as the slope steepened. They reached the edge of the hollow and stopped. The chief turned. She didn't just run, he said. Not accusing, not even angry, just final. The cowboy didn't speak. She took something, the chief went on. Something that was not hers to carry. The cowboy narrowed his eyes. What? Not what, the chief said. Who? There was movement at the far end of the clearing. A low rustle, then the shift of a body in the dark. A shape emerged, small and trembling, a boy, maybe 6 or 7, wrapped in a patchwork blanket, too large for his frame. Dirt clung to his cheeks. His eyes, wide and dark, met the cowboy's only for a moment before dropping to the ground. He was chosen, the chief said. To cross over, not for punishment, not for anger, for balance, for cleansing. The cowboy's mouth stayed shut, but the cords in his neck tightened. She took him the night before the ceremony. She did not ask, she did not speak, she just vanished with him. The chief stepped closer, his voice low now, nearly a growl. Do you know what that means, stranger? What it undid? The cowboy's eyes flicked to the boy, then back to the chief. It means she saw something you didn't. The chief's jaw clenched. You call it balance, the cowboy said, voice steady. She called it murder. The two young warriors behind the chief tensed, but he raised a hand, stilling them. Then he stepped closer until they were eye to eye. She stole a spirit meant for the fire. Our people buried their grief in ritual. She tore it open with disobedience. And then she brought him here, to your town. Hid him like a stolen coin. The cowboy stiffened. The weight of it sank in slow. He'd seen no child, heard no whispers. But the pieces clicked into place like snapped twigs. She knew they wouldn't protect her if they knew why, the chief said. So she stayed quiet. Let the shame belong only to us. The cowboy swallowed. He's just a boy. And so was the last one. The chief's voice dropped to a whisper. We do not choose them lightly. He turned away, stepping back to the ring of stone. She broke the bond between earth and sky, and you shelter her. Silence. Then the chief spoke once more, softer now. Would you kill her to keep your lie quiet? The cowboy looked down at the feather in his hand. He didn't answer. The first crack came with a whisper, passed between two men hauling water near the stables. Just a rumor at first. A child. Not from town. Not on any roll call. Not with any family name. The kind of child who shouldn't be there. The kind of child who was never supposed to survive. By dusk, it had spread like wildfire through the dust-thick alleys and over the dry clapboard walls of the town. The girl, the one everyone feared but didn't know, wasn't just some wandering stranger. She had taken something. Someone. Not just broken a border but a law, the kind people here hadn't named aloud in years, but still carried in their marrow. A law that said, don't make trouble, and don't invite it in. Voices rose with the sun slipping low behind the rooftops. They gathered near the well first, where she had sat the day before, with that quiet stillness that now looked, to them, like deception. A man shouted, then another. She brought him here, hid him under our noses. They're burning because of her. The sheriff didn't appear. The preacher stayed inside, doors locked, and the bartender, who had once offered her water, now stared at the empty glass on the counter like it had betrayed him. It didn't take long for a torch to be lit. The stable boy saw it first, just one at first, held high, swaying as the man carrying it called for justice. Then more joined. No one asked who the child was. No one asked if the story was true. The details didn't matter. What mattered was the weight of fear trying to balance itself with fury. The girl had run the moment she saw the glow. Not far, not out into the night, but to the only place still open to silence. The church. She ducked inside, shawl tight around her, and pressed her back to the heavy door, breath ragged, clutching the pouch to her chest like it could shield her from flame. Outside, footsteps scraped against stone. Angry, lost, hungry for someone to blame. Then a rock hit the chapel window. Then another. The preacher peeked through the crack of his study door but said nothing. The crowd gathered on the steps, faces contorted by firelight, mouths shouting words none of them would remember clearly later. Send her out. We deserve to be safe. She's not one of us. Someone poured lamp oil on the chapel steps. And then just before the match was struck, a voice broke through. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. You'd trade her life, it said, for a secret you were part of? Every head turned. The stable boy stood alone near the fence, small hands gripping the top rail. His voice trembled, but not from fear. From conviction. You all knew, he said, looking from face to face. You knew someone was missing. You just didn't ask. Now you want to burn her for finding him. The silence that followed was deep and uneasy, the kind that made men hear themselves breathing, the kind that forced truth into the open, where it burned hotter than any torch. No one threw the match. The chapel doors creaked open slowly, and every head turned. Firelight still flickered outside from the torches that hadn't yet been doused. The crowd had thinned but not broken. They stood in tight knots on the steps and across the yard, arms crossed, weapons idle but not holstered. The air between them stretched taut as wire. The cowboy entered first, his coat dusted with ash and hill soil, his boots leaving clean tracks in the dust-covered floor. Behind him came the war chief, flanked by two men from his party, silent, alert, their eyes reading every beam and pew like they were tallying sins. No one stopped them. No one dared. The girl stood near the front of the church, still clutching the medicine bag. She didn't recoil when she saw the chief. She didn't run. She just watched, breath shallow, like a deer caught in the space between threat and grace. The cowboy walked to the altar, slow and deliberate. He took the pouch from her hands not forcefully, but with care, and turned to face the room. The preacher hovered near the pulpit, clearly torn between stepping back and standing firm. He said nothing, only nodded once, giving silent permission for whatever was about to happen. The cowboy placed the pouch on the altar and untied it. He didn't spill its contents, didn't make a show of it. He reached in, pulled out the item he needed, and laid it bare on the polished wood. A single tooth, long and ridged, yellowed at the root, polished at the tip. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for a relic, or a charm, but those who knew really knew understood what it was. Ceremonial. Sacrificial. A tooth taken from the chief's nephew when he was barely more than a child. It had been given to him at birth, meant to be taken back upon death. It marked the cycle, the offering to balance a blight or restore a failing harvest. The chief stepped forward, his gaze locked on the tooth. His shoulders, so tense with wrath just hours before, shifted slightly, not softened, not surrendered, but stilled. She saved him, the cowboy said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. That's why she ran. He looked out across the pews, at the townsfolk who had nearly set flame to the place not half an hour before. Their eyes were on the altar now, on the object that had shattered their excuses. She didn't come to trick you, the cowboy went on. Didn't come to spy, she came to hide him. Because the only thing worse than stealing a child from fire is letting people believe he never existed. A murmur rippled through the church. The girl stepped forward. Her hand rested beside the tooth, but she didn't touch it. "I didn't lie," she said. "I just didn't speak. Because I knew you'd be more afraid of the truth." The war chief walked to the altar and picked up the tooth. His expression didn't change, but when he looked at the girl, something in his eyes did. Recognition, mourning, and something dangerously close to forgiveness. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. The air inside the church was the kind that clung to skin thick with breath, regret, and the weight of choices that had no names yet. No one moved at first, no one spoke. The tooth still sat on the altar, a symbol made heavier by the hush it had drawn from the room. Outside, the torches had guttered low, their embers curling into the wind like questions no one wanted to ask out loud. The girl stood at the front, chin high, but her hands were clenched at her sides. Her eyes, which had once scanned every room for exits, now held still. If she was afraid, she didn't show it. But fear had never been what kept this town quiet. It was something else now, something harder to name. Guilt, shame, or maybe the first breath of conscience in a place that had forgotten what it sounded like. The preacher was the first to move. He stepped out from behind the pulpit with a slow dignity, his long coat brushing against the pews as he passed. His face was unreadable, but his steps were steady. He stopped beside the girl and faced the crowd. No sermon, no flourish, just a clear, tired voice. "She told the truth," he said. No one replied. "She did what many of us wouldn't. Not because she had to. Because she couldn't live with doing nothing." He looked toward the altar, then back at the pews. There are those who would have let the boy burn. And there are those who looked the other way while it happened. That's not judgment. That's cowardice dressed as tradition. Then he stepped aside and sat down on the same bench as the girl. The stable boy followed next. He walked from the back, small boots echoing louder than any man's steps had. He moved past his father, who reached out but didn't stop him. The boy climbed up next to the preacher, knees swinging slightly above the floor. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Then came the bartender. A slow, reluctant rise from the third pew. He wiped his palms on his apron and cleared his throat, like he meant to speak, but only gave a shallow nod before moving to the front and taking a place behind them. The shift was quiet, but it spread. A woman near the door, one who had shouted loudest the night before, looked around, met no one's gaze, and finally sank back into her seat, folding her hands in her lap like she'd just laid down a weapon. Another man, the blacksmith, crossed his arms and muttered something no one heard, then gave a low grunt that might have meant agreement or surrender. No vote was called. The choice was made in stillness. The sheriff leaned in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the night behind him. He didn't move, didn't speak, but after a long pause, he gave the barest nod. Not approval, not apology, just acknowledgement. And in a place like this, that was enough. At the center of the room, the war chief remained standing. His face held no smile, no release. But his eyes searched the girls one last time. What passed between them then was not peace, not forgiveness, but it was enough to leave without blood. And in some stories, that's more than most get. Dawn came slow, bleeding across the hills in soft pink streaks that did nothing to warm the morning. Mist clung to the low fields, curling around fence posts and wagon wheels like something reluctant to let go. The fires on the ridge were gone. So were the shadows of men who had held the town's breath hostage through the long night. The war party rode out without ceremony, their horses moving in a line that didn't speak of retreat, only closure. They left no tracks that the earth wasn't willing to swallow. The town stirred cautiously. No one cheered, no one sang. The children were still kept inside, and the adults spoke in low voices, as if the echoes might still carry up into the hills. A kind of reverence hung in the air, not for survival, but for what had been narrowly avoided. There was no triumph, only aftermath. Outside the chapel, the girl stood barefoot in the cold dirt, arms wrapped around her middle, her shawl clinging to her like a second skin. She watched the riders until they vanished into the horizon, every muscle in her body taut, like she wasn't yet sure it was real, like they might turn back. The cowboy stood nearby, hands in his coat pockets, hat pulled low. He hadn't said much since the vote. He didn't need to. His presence said everything, that he wasn't going anywhere. That no matter how many had sat beside her in the church, she wasn't alone now, not truly. The sheriff passed by without meeting their eyes. The preacher gave a slow nod, then walked toward the church, pushing the door open with a weariness that seemed to settle in his bones now that danger had passed. The stable boy waved once from across the yard. The girl offered a soft smile in return, small, unsure, but real. There was no declaration, no marker placed. But something had shifted in the dirt and the dust and the hearts of the people. A line had been drawn, not the kind that carves borders on a map, but the kind that lives in memory, in conscience, in the weight of what's remembered when eyes close at night. A line between what was once tolerated and what would no longer be. She didn't speak of leaving, and no one asked her to. There was work to be done, roofs to mend, fields to clear, a child to protect. The boy she'd saved remained hidden, for now quiet as a breath in the shadow of what had almost been, but he was there, living proof of the choices made in secret and defended in public. The cowboy made no plans. He just stayed, helped fix what had cracked in the walls and in the people, ate when food was offered, spoke when it mattered, and sat beside her in silence when it didn't. They never called it a pact, never shook hands. But every sunrise that followed, every step they took beside each other in that worn and weary town, was a kind of promise. No blood had been spilled, but no one would ever be the same. Snow had come early that year, soft and dry, layering the rooftops in pale silence. The air held the kind of stillness that only winter could bring, where even sound felt like it moved slower. Smoke curled steadily from chimneys. The roads were packed with frost-hardened mud, boots crunching faintly under each step. The town hadn't grown, but it had settled. The sharpness that once lingered in every glance, every whispered word, had dulled. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a one-room building with crooked shutters and a stove that clanged more than it warmed. The girl, no longer a mystery but still more than most understood, stood at the front of the room with chalk in hand. Her dress was simple, sleeves rolled, hair tied back with a strip of worn cloth. The children watched her not with suspicion, but curiosity, the kind that left room for respect. She taught letters, numbers, and names from stories too old for paper. When they asked where she learned them, she only smiled and pointed to the sky. The boy, smaller than most but faster than any, darted from door to door with rolled-up notes and muddy boots. His cheeks stayed red with cold and running, and he knew exactly when to arrive and when to disappear. He had become a fixture, like the post or the well, and people no longer looked at him like a question, just a boy who belonged. The cowboy worked as he always had, quiet, steady, with sleeves rolled up and a nail tucked behind his ear. He fixed what sagged, patched what cracked, rebuilt what others had given up on. His hammer was heard more often than his voice, but when he spoke, people listened. He didn't preach, didn't warn, but somehow, he never needed to. His presence alone was enough. The sheriff still walked his rounds, the preacher still gave his sermons, but both seemed lighter now, like something had been laid down that no longer needed carrying. The hills beyond the town remained untouched. No one claimed them, no one trespassed, but they were no longer watched like an open wound. They were simply there, part of the land, part of the past that had been faced and, in some way, honored. One morning, as the sun cracked over the ridge in brittle light, a hawk circled above the schoolhouse. Its wings cast long shadows over the frost below. The children looked up. So did the girl. No words were said, but for a moment, the world held still, as if listening. Then, faint and far away, a sound carried through the wind, a drum. Just one beat, then another. No panic rose, no hands reached for guns. It wasn't a call to war. Just a reminder that the old world still breathed, that memory still had rhythm, that the choices made a season ago still echoed in the cold. And the town weathered, wary but whole, listened without fear. The snow had begun to melt, just enough to turn the edges of the roads into slush and reveal the brown ribs of earth underneath. Winter wasn't over, but it had loosened its grip. The sun rose earlier now, hanging low and pale in the sky like an old lantern with a flickering wick. The days stretched a little longer, though time moved the same as it always had, quietly, steadily, without asking permission. He was up on the roof of the livery again, hammering down loose shingles, sleeves rolled, breath steaming in the morning air. The wood creaked under his boots. Somewhere nearby, the blacksmith's anvil rang out in a steady rhythm, and behind that, the faint sound of children reciting a lesson from the schoolhouse. A normal day, one of many. The girl came walking down the main road, her shawl tucked neatly around her shoulders, a book pressed to her chest. Her hair had grown longer, her voice carried now gently but without fear. She greeted the shopkeeper. She stopped to untangle a child's scarf. She was part of the place now, not merely tolerated, but known. Yet there were still questions people hadn't asked her, and one she had never asked him. Until now. She stopped at the base of the ladder where he worked, squinting up into the Sunday. "Would you do it again?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. He paused. The hammer hung in his hand mid-swing, the silence between them stretching long and easy like an old road. A gust of wind rustled the loose hay piled in the wagon nearby, sending a few strands dancing into the air. The moment held. He didn't look down at her, didn't speak, just reached up, adjusted his hat with a gloved hand, and tipped it forward. Then, he kept walking along the ridge of the roof, the boards groaning faintly underfoot, as if answering for him. There was no need for words. She watched him for a moment longer, then turned and walked on, her footsteps soft against the dampened dirt, the morning carrying her forward into a town that had once been ready to burn her. The wind shifted. A hawk cried overhead. Somewhere out beyond the hills, where snow still blanketed the ground and memory still clung to trees, a drumbeat echoed low, distant, and measured. Not a threat. Just a presence. The screen fades to black. Then a line, spoken not in voice but felt like a tremor in the chest. Next time, the outlaw who hanged himself then rode into town the next day.